If you're a big nerd in your field, every once in a while you come across someone that seems to be everything you wish you could be, right? You realize, like, you find someone in art or in music, or in my case, philosophy, psychology, political theory, all the subjects I'm interested in. Every once in a while I'll come across a Tolstoy or a Chomsky, or top of my list, Eric Fromm, who their work covers everything that you hoped you would cover someday. And you realize you're quickly, obviously not as smart as them, but you think that if I spent more time and I was a little smarter, I would have come to produce these kinds of works, I would have come to these conclusions. And as you find this person, the more things you look at, they've already covered it, right? They produced a book on a subject that you were going to think about next, your next field you were going to look at. So Fromm, right? When he is studying political economics and Marxism, you see, oh my gosh, he already covered this and he reached all the conclusions I might have reached if I was smarter. And then he covers the psychology of deviance and evil, right? So every time I'm going to study a new subject, I will look and, oh, Fromm already covered that one too. So that happened for quite a few years of my life. I simply love Fromm so much that I get erotically confused by this love. He's dead, right? He's also a man. I'm alive and heterosexual, but oh my gosh. And if you watch his videos, he is also was, sorry, that's sad, he's no longer with us. He was a really sweet man too, right? Just such a neat guy. Anyway, so another one of these figures that I absolutely adore. Now, who is he? Eric Fromm used to be incredibly famous. In the 50s and 60s across the world, and including in our stupid country, the United States, everybody knew his name. Your grandparents, right? New Mexico grandparents, maybe your parents if you're older, right? They knew who Fromm was. Everybody, all the nerdy, bookish people were reading things like The Art of Loving and Escape from Freedom. He was a household name. But what happens? Oh, by the way, he was also in every textbook of psychology during the 70s, 80s, even early 90s. He was still getting coverage. And then all of a sudden he disappears. I think mainly because he's very socialist and outspoken about being a socialist, or a democratic socialist, to be careful. And I guess that just lost favor of the United States after Reagan, right? You know how that goes. But all of a sudden he disappears when he was just everywhere. Now, to give a more scholastic definition of him, he is one of a group of what are called the critical theorists. These are people who take major ideas and show how they can be used as critiques of our society today. So, focus on Fromm's case. Fromm takes the ideas of Marx and Freud, updates them, says, like, here are the mistakes that Freud and Marx made because of the time that they were studying. And he says, now let's take the pure concepts of Freud and Marx and show how they can work as a criticism of today's society so that we can see what's really wrong in the very structure of society and fix it. Exactly. This is how I think philosophy should be done. You will notice that often when I teach, I don't teach these things as, here's a historical idea. I teach them as challenges for us. Things that we can learn about and use these as ideals to see what's wrong and how we can do better in our society, in our lives. Anyway, so love Fromm, right? I will try not to spoon his works as we're working, right? I will try to stay composed. Let's start by talking about the statistics he brings up. So he brings up these stats, and some people say, oh, that's very much overreaching. Now, it is true. Let's talk about this. It is true that saying someone has alcoholism doesn't mean that they have a mental health problem, right? It is a bad symptom, but being an alcoholic could have multiple causes. But is it a possible sign of mental instability? Is it a possible sign, say, of self-medicating depression or something? Sure, we would have to say that. But by itself, it doesn't indicate that someone has a mental health problem. What if someone is homicidal, right? Does committing murder mean that you, the agent who did it, have a mental health problem? No, but again, it's a symptom, right? By itself, it could have multiple causes, but that does make some kind of mental health problem more likely. Suicide, again. Suicide by itself doesn't indicate mental health problems. We'd have to study the person, their age, their situation, what kind of depression are they dealing with, or none at all, of course, but again, a symptom. So here is all that Fromm is saying. Let's pretend that we're doing a study of whatever city you're in. And you find that in that city there are, say, fairly normal rates across the whole city of alcoholism, suicide, and homicide. And then you're studying your city and find, wow, there's one neighborhood over here that is the highest in homicide. It's really near the top in suicide. And wow, it also has high alcoholism rates. Out of all of these parts of the city, this one little suburb here is high in all three markers. And none of the other areas of the city is high in any more than one of them. You would say, we've got to study that part of the city. Now, one normal thing you might come up with if you're being a house, right, a diagnostician, you might say maybe there's some environmental problem, right? Maybe their water is full of lead or something and it's making them all nuts, right? It's not Fromm's point, but you would start to look at these things. You would very definitely say, this is worth studying. Well, this is basically what you find if you study countries. You will find that many countries in the world have some problems with suicide, other countries have homicide, other countries have violent crime, right? Whatever. But when Fromm looks at the United States, he finds they're high in all three of these indicators, and no other country is high on all three. Some countries might be relatively high in two, but the United States is almost always near the top in all three of them. In fact, the only time you'll find another country reaching up higher than the United States in, say, violent crime is when they're in the midst of genocide or civil war or something like this. Well, the United States is incredibly high in violent crime, even when they're not at war at all. We are high all the time. And in fact, we're actually low for us right now, which is insane to think that we're still far higher than anyone else that's not at a civil war, and we have these super high rates. And then, of course, you could start to look at other rates. We could look at things like teen pregnancy, STD rates. We could look at incarceration rates, gun ownership. We could look at all sorts of things, and we would always find, wow, the United States is unique. Military spending for a country that's not at war. Technically, we're not at war, right? We seem a little crazy. Now, Fromm is not saying that these are clinical problems. Having clinical depression is different than having symptoms of depression that could be socially caused. Well, of course, he's looking more at the latter. He is not trying to say the United States just happens to have a bunch of people that are clinically depressed or some things like this. He is saying something about the society produces these symptoms. One more analog. We can notice homeless populations. We could say, oh, there seems to be a lot of problems in terms of mental health problems among the homeless. We could say they might even have identity dissociative disorder, right? Some forms of schizophrenia or things like this, because we see them talking to themselves a lot or whatever. Now, of course, turns out to be PTSD. A lot of these are veterans. But partly the reality of being homeless can produce some of these symptoms. So you would say, were these people clinically schizophrenic? And most likely not. What happened to them produced these symptoms. Veterans with PTSD, not their fault. These are symptoms they've gotten from their military duties. Or even just the lifestyle of being homeless could produce some very symptomatic sorts of traits that you would say could be indicators of mental health problems, even though they're not clinically caused, socially caused. Standard. All right, so let's start reading. Very beginning of the Fromm. Nothing is more common than the idea that we, the people living in the Western world of the 20th century, are eminently sane. Even the fact that a great number of individuals in our midst suffer from more or less severe forms of mental illness produces little doubt with respect to the general standard of our mental health. Skip 3 lines. Can we be so sure that we are not deceiving ourselves? Many an inmate of an insane asylum is convinced that everybody else is crazy except himself. Many a severe neurotic believes that his compulsive rituals or his hysterical outbursts are normal reactions to somewhat abnormal circumstances. What about ourselves? First, let's just deal with the illustrations he's making. Can you imagine a couple people in an insane asylum completely high-fiving each other all the time because they get it and no one else does? All those people outside don't realize the dangers. And maybe they have different psychoses, right? Maybe Stan over here, he's the one that's trying to worry about the attack of the invisible elephants. And so over there is working on the robot butterfly sent by the CIA. And one of them has their giant net, the other one has their tinfoil pyramid hat, right? But they still would say, we are in this together. All these people out here don't realize the attacks of the butterflies or the elephants, and we can work together. Well, Fromm is saying that's what you are like. He is saying when he looks around, he sees a bunch of crazy people, but they all get along because they're similarly crazy. They are working together in their asylum. Yeah. So let's go through this more generally, try to be more sociologically careful. How many of your friends, relatives, close family, or maybe even more distant family are diagnosed with some fairly serious psychological problems? Let's ask a more pointed question. How many people in your family are on serious psychotropic medications for things like bipolar disorder, for things like depression? A lot. And we kind of look past it, right? Oh, okay, that's pretty normal, right? When we ask other people, we find that, yeah, similar. Families have a high percentage of people being treated for fairly serious psychological problems. Let's focus on another one. How many children in school are on fairly serious psychotropic drugs for things like ADHD? A lot, right? The foster care system. How many foster kids, right, are on serious psychotropics for ADHD and depression? A lot. And we look around us and we say, this is fairly normal, and we don't think anything is wrong with our society. Try an illustration. What do you say about a 7-year-old girl who is in school and she can't pay attention? She just is mentally incapable of listening to her teacher talk about comma placements or fractions. And she would much rather spin in her chair, pick on her friends, draw doodles, right, that might be inappropriate, and she just cannot pay attention. Now, of course, what happens? Well, she is not well suited to our institutions, so she needs a diagnosis and she needs medication. And what should we say is wrong with her? Think. What is wrong with her is she's 7. What 7-year-old wants to sit still at a desk for 45 minutes at a time learning something she's not interested in yet? Sure, grammar might become interesting later, but right now it's not. You would probably much rather spin in your chair, draw inappropriate drawings, and poke at your friends than you would sit there listening to a conversation about comma placements or fractions. She is normal, but she is not fitting our institution. She's not succeeding in an institution, so according to our conception of sanity, she needs to be fixed. She needs to be diagnosed with a problem and needs to be medicated so that she can succeed in our institutions. Well, that means we need to be clear on what we mean by sanity. What do we mean when we say someone is not functioning, right? Is there something wrong with them? With the little schoolgirl, it means something is wrong with her, right? Can't be the schools are the problem. You're starting to see it. So here is where we need Fromm, because he is going to make it possible for us to not blame the little girl. Let's read. So after the first little break at the top of page 3, technically second paragraph, top of page 3. To speak of a whole society as lacking in mental health implies a controversial assumption contrary to the position of sociological relativism held by most social scientists today. They postulate that each society is normal inasmuch as it functions, and that pathology can be defined only in terms of the individual's lack of adjustment to the ways of life in his society. Now, Some people are confused by this portion of Fromm because he is writing in the way that I love when philosophers and thinkers write like this, where they are bringing up the idea that they're confronting, that they create almost a dialogue between their own ideas and other popular ideas. This is what Plato does. This is what Dostoevsky does, right? It's brilliant. The sociological relativist position is the popular position in our society, and he is talking about it in order to slam it down, right? He's going to slap this thing around and show how stupid it is. So don't confuse this with his view. But let's first get clear. The sociological relativist view says that you can only define sanity by looking at the structure of a society and letting the society define it. So, in this sense, sanity could be defined as being well-adjusted or succeeding in a society and its institutions. The institution, the society, notice the relativism, defines what sanity is. And so, people need to adapt to the structure of their society, and if they can't adapt to it, we need to fix the people. Notice, I think that's just stupid. Keep going and let's look at his view. So, third paragraph, page 3. The approach of normative humanism, right? Fromm's view, my view. The approach of normative humanism is based on the assumption that, as in any other problem, there are right and wrong, satisfactory and unsatisfactory solutions to the problems of human existence. Mental health is achieved if man develops into full maturity according to the characteristics and laws of human nature. Mental illness consists in the failure of such development. From this premise, the criterion of mental health is not one of individual adjustment to a given social order, but a universal one, valid for all men and women of giving a satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence. One more paragraph. What is so deceptive about the state of mind of the members of a society is the consensual validation of their concepts. It is naively assumed that the fact that the majority of people share certain ideas or feelings proves the validity of these ideas and feelings. Nothing is further from the truth. The fact that millions of people share the same vices does not make these vices virtues. The fact that they share so many errors does not make the errors to be truths. And the fact that millions of people share the same forms of mental pathology does not make these people sane. Now notice, go back to what he said on the first page. Can a lot of people say that they're hysterical outbursts, they're door locking, they're collecting guns, they're washing their hands over and over, right? They're screaming at the politicians on Fox News. They could say, oh no, I'm normal, we're just in some weird times. No, we're not in any weird times. This is pretty standard stuff, right? Politicians always were like that. We just had a break for a handful of years after FDR. After FDR, and for the next, 30 years, we had politicians trying to get along. Before that, and since Reagan, it's been the opposite. That's how it always used to be, right? Anyway, but we do say that, oh, strange times, so it's normal for me to be freaked out and scared and hate everyone. No, right? Don't excuse your neuroses by saying we're in unique times. So let me try to give a definition of sanity that fits our intuitions. What do we say about the little girl? She's not insane. It's just schools aren't made well for 7-year-old girls. They should be organized differently. Exactly. If you have institutions that aren't well suited to a human being, you need to change the institutions, not change the human beings. So try a really corny version of this definition, and we're going to look at more of my art. Okay, so try this. All right, so let's take a very sad example and talk about anorexia. Anorexia, like most psychological disorders, exists on a spectrum. You could have slight anorexia to full-blown, right, pathological anorexia. Good, well, that's like sanity. But let's talk about how we would define it. Can a society define anorexia and say, well, everyone around here is super real thin, so everybody's fine? No, right? There's a definition, because with biological health, you could say there's a baseline. So let's make that comparison throughout. All right, so let's try this. Let's say that I'm hungry, but I have anorexia. And here is, you love my art, here is an apple. Now, If we go in the baseline scenario and we would say, what if I am very, very hungry, right? To the point of ill health. I am starving. And there is an apple and I don't eat it. There's an apple waiting for me right there, and that would satiate my hunger and give my body what it needs. And I don't eat to the point of where I die. You would say that is anorexia to the point of insanity. That person is not meeting their needs because of their psychological problems and they die. Well, of course. We know with our physiological needs, if you don't meet them, you die. And what would happen if you only partially meet your biological, physiological needs? You'll deteriorate and eventually die. So take an example like an alcoholic. An alcoholic only ingests alcohol, almost nothing else. Let's say we're at the radical far end of the psychosis spectrum with alcoholism. Well, what will happen? Now, their biological needs are being partially met. There's a lot of fat in alcohol, so at least your central nervous system is getting a little bit of fat. That person can survive, but they're going to start shutting down. They are going to deteriorate in their physiological needs. Well, now let's look at a more social psychological problem. So let's say I am anorexic. Now I'm loving this metaphor. Let's say I'm anorexic. And this time I don't eat apples, right? Because I think I'm fat because I'm crazy, right? And I only eat pictures of apples. I eat pictures of apples and not apples, right? I eat apple-shaped nutrient pills or something. Well, what's going to happen? Sure, I'm going to feel like I'm eating something, but I'm not going to get nutrients. I'm going to deteriorate and die. So we can talk about that. Let's compare these ideas. If one of your physiological needs is completely unmet, you clearly will die. If one of your physiological needs is only partially met, you will deteriorate, right? You will have all sorts of symptoms of ill health, and you will eventually die young. Well, what would we say about our psychological needs? What if one of our psychological needs, go back to our list, right? Our needs for love, expression, purpose, acceptance, or one of our negative needs for things like safety and security. What if these are completely unmet? Psychological death is the result. You will go nuts, right? You will lose your sanity. What if they are only partially met, right? What if you find now I love my metaphor, what if you only partially meet your need for expression and freedom, right? What if you only partially meet your need for love? Or, like you meet them in fake ways on social media. You don't present a real self to the world for acceptance. You don't express yourself in real ways. You make your eyebrows different or go to the gym and try to look like somebody else. And you think that's getting your need for acceptance and expression met. Well, you're nuts. You're eating a picture of love, a picture of expression and acceptance. And what's going to happen? Well, this is a psychological need that's only partially met. You're going to start developing a bunch of psychoses and neuroses to try to cope with this stuff. You're going to have some coping mechanisms that are going to help you to feel like you're okay. Exactly. So are we completely adaptable? No. Yes, we could say, here's what I would argue, that those needs we came up with, they're universal across the world. They must be met. But of course, your culture and your context will define how they are met. You are going to look for different means of acceptance based on what culture you're in, but the need is the same. These needs aren't completely adaptable. We can adapt to different ways of having them met, but they must be met. If a society is structured in a way that doesn't meet these in the way that we really need them, we are going to see a lot of the things like we see in our society. We are going to see a bunch of coping mechanisms that are psychologically unhealthy. So based on all of that, we can have a very straightforward definition of sanity. So what is sanity for the normative humanist? It is rationally seeking and meeting your real needs. Notice the key words there. Rationally, you're in touch with reality. You are not mistaking your acceptance for some fake self. Again, buying shoes doesn't give you acceptance. I mean, all the person is saying is, oh, you follow the ads well. You got the right popular shoes, right? Good researching what's popular. No, that's not you. Anyway, rationally seeking and meeting your real needs. Rationally and real needs. not replacing your needs with ones that can be met by society, but the actual needs you have. Which brings us to the socially patterned defect, right? Go. So halfway down page 3, the paragraph begins, there is, I'm going to the second line. If a person fails to attain freedom, spontaneity, a genuine expression of self, he may be considered to have a severe defect, provided we assume that freedom and spontaneity are the objective goals to be attained by every human being. If such a goal is not attained by the majority of members of any given society, we deal with the phenomenon of socially patterned defect. The individual shares it with many others, he is not aware of it as a defect, and his security is not threatened by the experience of being different, of being an outcast, as it were. What he may have lost in richness and in a genuine feeling of happiness is made up by the security of fitting in with the rest of mankind as he knows them. As a matter of fact, his very defect may have been raised to a virtue by his culture, and this may give him an enhanced feeling of achievement. Next paragraph. Today we come across a person who acts and feels like an automaton, a robot, who never experiences anything which is really his, who experiences himself entirely as the person he thinks he is supposed to be, whose artificial smile has replaced genuine laughter, whose meaningless chatter has replaced communicative speech, whose dull despair has taken the place of genuine pain. We see this everywhere. Fake people who are going through the motions by playing a role. Go back to the waiter, right? Go back to bad faith right there. So let's talk about what this would be. If it's a socially patterned defect, let's deal with it in its pieces. If something is defective, what does that mean? It doesn't mean it's missing. It doesn't mean it's simply broken. It means what? It means it's not doing what it's supposed to, right? If something has a defect, that means it has a function and it's not fitting it. Well, in this case, a human being's function is to meet its needs, right? To meet its biological needs so it can survive, and to meet its psychological and sociological needs so that it can function in a healthy way and find satisfaction and happiness. And so what would it mean if this is a socially patterned defect? What would it mean that a human is not fulfilling its function and this is socially patterned? Well, what does that mean? That means that this defect is normal in society. Take it a step farther. In these cases, these things are not only normal, they're encouraged by the society. This is seen as the goals of the society. For instance, let's talk some examples. What are some examples of socially patterned defects? Now, we can start with the easy ones. Alcoholism. Is it normal to need, well, let's focus on an easier one. Is it normal to need coffee to wake up every day? No, right? That is weird. You shouldn't need some stimulant just to get ready for your day. That means your life isn't stimulating. You need an artificial form of it. Go to alcohol. Is alcohol normal in our society? Sure. Try to go to an outing where people are drinking, and like me, I don't drink, and just tell people, oh, I don't drink. They get offended, right? Like, what's wrong with you? Right here, come on, just a little bit. Like, what? Why does it matter to you? I didn't tell you to not drink. But we know that something is weird about it. It's such a social pattern that we don't like it when people don't fit it. I just don't need alcohol. I don't need coffee, right? Now, let's talk about ones that are even more important, more everyday. Is it a defect to be greedy? Is it a defect to be selfish? Yes, right? How is that going to do? Compare that to your real needs. Are you going to have an easier time finding love, companionship, if you are a greedy and selfish person? No, that's going to ruin those relationships, right? It's a defect. What about this one? Well, by the way, are greed and selfishness promoted, encouraged, and common in our society? Yes, right? We applaud these things, right? We'll vote you president if you're a neurotic narcissist who only cares about selfishness and greed. You'll be our next president. Cough. Try another one. Is it common in our society to encourage people to seek after classes and majors, take jobs, even take careers they're not interested in? Yes. This is not only common, it's encouraged and applauded, right? Tell your parents, for example, if you're young, that you're thinking of majoring in dance or art or philosophy. They will freak out. If you tell them these are my passions in life, you will not be applauded. If you say, well, I don't really like money, I don't really like math, but I'm going to study finance, oh, they will applaud you. They don't care you're not interested in it. That's the goal. Now, is this good for you? Is this healthy or is this a defect? It's a defect. How well are you going to do in your psychological needs if all of your energy and efforts are aimed at things you're not interested in? Going to a job, studying in school, things you have no passion for, this is going to seriously affect your ability to express yourself and find the kind of acceptance that you crave, because you are going to be doing things you don't want to do and being identified as something that you don't like. Are these things normal? Yes, and you wonder why we're so nuts. Thanks.